Hey, welcome back. Here we are again for another week of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. Another Monday's Methods of Rationality. I'm your host for the week, Chris Costa, and thanks for joining me. This week I'd like to dedicate the episode to my grandmother, Ama, or Marianne, who sadly passed away last week. She was a wonderful human being and inspired me to do many things in my life and generally be a pretty good person, just like her. So I hope you enjoy the reading this week. And we are up to chapter 13, The Unknown and the Unknowable. "Come in," said Professor McGonagall's muffled voice. Harry did so. The office of the deputy headmistress was clean and well organised. On the wall, immediately adjacent to the desk, was a maze of wooden cubbyholes of all shapes and sizes, most with several parchment scrolls thrust into them, and it was somehow very clear that Professor McGonagall knew exactly what every cubbyhole meant, even if no one else did. A single parchment lay on the actual desk, which was, aside from that, clean. Beside the desk was a closed door, barred with several locks. Professor McGonagall was sitting on a backless stool behind the desk, looking puzzled. Her eyes had widened, with perhaps a slight note of apprehension as she saw Harry. "Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall, "what is this about?" Harry's mind went blank. He'd been instructed by the game to come here, and he had been expecting her to have something in mind. "Mr. Potter?" said Professor McGonagall, starting to look slightly annoyed. Thankfully, Harry's panicking brain remembered at this point that he did have something he'd been planning to discuss with Professor McGonagall. Something important and well worth her time. Harry said, If there are any spells you can cast to make sure no one is listening to us." Professor McGonagall stood up from her chair, firmly closed the outer door, and began taking out her wand and saying spells. It was at this point that Harry realised he was faced with a priceless and possibly irreplaceable opportunity to offer Professor McGonagall a comet tea. And he couldn't believe he was seriously thinking that and it would be fine. And he couldn't believe he was seriously thinking that, and it would be fine. The soda would vanish after a few seconds, and he told that part of himself to shut up. It did, and Harry began to organise mentally what he was going to say. He hadn't planned to have this discussion quite so soon, but so long as he was here. Professor McGonagall finished a spell that sounded a lot older than Latin, and then she sat down again. "All right," she said in a quiet voice. "No one's listening." Her face was rather tight. "Oh, right. She's expecting me to blackmail her for information about the prophecy." Harry'd get around to that some other day. "It's about the incident with the sorting hat," Harry said. Professor McGonagall blinked. I think there's an extra spell on the sorting hat, something that the sorting hat itself doesn't know about, something that triggers when the sorting hat says Slytherin. I heard a message that I'm pretty sure Ravenclaws are not supposed to hear. It came the moment the sorting hat was off my head, and I felt the connection break. It sounded like a hiss and like English at the same time. There was a sharp intake of breath from McGonagall, and it said, "Salutations from Slytherin to Slytherin. If you would seek my secrets, speak to my snake." Professor McGonagall sat there with her mouth open, staring at Harry as if he'd grown another 2 heads. "So," Professor McGonagall said slowly, as though she couldn't believe the words that were coming out of her own lips. you decided to come to me right away and tell me about it. Well, yes, of course, Harry said. There was no need to admit how long it had taken him to actually think of that, as opposed to, say, trying to research it myself or telling any of the other children. I see, Professor McGonagall said. And if, perhaps, you were to discover the entrance to Salazar Slytherin's legendary Chamber of Secrets, an entrance that you and you alone could open, I would close the entrance and report to you at once so that a team of experienced magical archaeologists could be assembled, Harry said promptly. Then I would open up the entrance again, and they would go in very carefully to make sure that there was nothing dangerous. I might go in later and look around, or if they needed me to open up something else, but it would be after the area had been declared clear and they had photographs of how everything looked before people started tromping around their priceless historical site. Professor McGonagall sat there with her mouth open, staring at him like he'd just turned into a cat. It's obvious if you're not in Gryffindor, Harry said kindly. I think, Professor McGonagall said in a rather choked voice, that you have far underestimated the rarity of common sense, Mr. Potter. That sounded about right, although a Hufflepuff would have said the same thing. Professor McGonagall paused, struck. That's true. Sorting Hat offered me Hufflepuff. She blinked at him as though she couldn't believe her own ears. Did it really? Yes. Mr. Potter, McGonagall said, and now her voice was low. 5 decades ago was the last time a student died within the walls of Hogwarts, and I am now certain that 5 decades ago was the last time someone heard that message. A chill went through Harry. There, I will be very sure to take no action whatsoever on this matter without consulting you, Professor McGonagall. He paused. And may I suggest that you get together the best people you can find and see if it's possible to get that extra spell off the Sorting Hat? And if you can't do that, maybe put on another spell, a quietus that briefly activates just as the hat is being removed from the student's head. That might work as a patch. There are no more dead students. Harry nodded with satisfaction. Professor McGonagall looked even more stunned, as if such a thing were imaginable. I cannot possibly award you enough house points for this without giving the house cup to Ravenclaw outright. Harry said, I'd rather not earn that many house points. Professor McGonagall was giving him a strange look. Why not? Harry was having a little difficulty putting it into words. Because it would just be too sad, you know, like back when I was still trying to go to school in the Muggle world, and whenever there was a group project, I'd go ahead and do the whole thing myself because the others would only slow me down. I'm fine with earning lots of points, more than anyone else even, but if I earn enough to be decisive in winning the House Cup just by myself, then it's like I'm carrying House Ravenclaw on my back, and that's too sad. I see, Professor McGonagall said hesitantly. It was apparent that this way of thinking had never occurred to her. Suppose I only awarded you 50 points then. Harry shook his head. It's not fair to the other children if I can earn lots of points for grown-up things that I can be a part of and they can't. How is Terry Boot supposed to earn 50 points for reporting a whisper he heard from the Sorting Hat? It wouldn't be fair at all. I see why the Sorting Hat offered you Hufflepuff, said Professor McGonagall. She was eyeing him with a strange respect. That made Harry choke up a bit. He'd honestly thought he wasn't worthy of Hufflepuff. that the Sorting Hat had just been trying to shove him anywhere but Ravenclaw into a house whose virtues he didn't have. Professor McGonagall was smiling now. If I tried to give you 10 points, are you going to explain where those 10 points came from, if anyone asks? There might be a lot of Slytherins, and I don't mean the children at Hogwarts, who would be really, really angry if they knew about the spell being taken off the Sorting Hat and found out I was involved. So I think that absolute secrecy is the better part of valour. No need to thank me, Ma'am. Virtue is its own reward. So it is, said Professor McGonagall, but I do have a very special something else to give you. I see that I have greatly wronged you in my thoughts, Mr. Potter. Please wait here. She got up, went over to the locked back door, waved her hand, and a sort of blurry curtain sprang up around her. Harry could neither see nor hear what was going on. It was a few minutes later that the blur vanished, and Professor McGonagall was standing there, facing him, with the door behind her looking as though it had never been opened. And Professor McGonagall held out in one hand a necklace, a thin golden chain bearing in its centre a silver device, within which was the device of an hourglass. In her other hand was a folded pamphlet. This is for you, she said. Wow! He was going to get some sort of neat magical item as a quest reward. Apparently the business with refusing offers of monetary rewards until you got a magical item actually worked in real life, not just computer games. Harry accepted his new necklace, smiling. What is it? Professor McGonagall took a breath. Mr. Potter, this is an item which is ordinarily lent only to children who have already shown themselves to be highly responsible in order to help them with their difficult class schedules. McGonagall hesitated, as though about to add something else. I must emphasize, Mr. Potter, that this item's true nature is secret, and that you must not tell any of the other students about it, or let them see you using it. If that is not acceptable to you, then you can give it back now. I can keep secrets, Harry said. So what does it do? So far as the other students are concerned, this is a spinster wicket, and it is used to treat a rare, non-contagious magical ailment called spontaneous duplication. You wear it under your clothes, and while you have no reason to show it to anyone, you also have no reason to treat it as an awful secret. Spinster wickets are not interesting. Do you understand, Mr. Potter? Harry nodded, his smile widening. He sensed the work of a competent Slytherin. And what does it really do? It's a time turner. Each spin of the hourglass sends you 1 hour back in time. So if you use it to go back 2 hours every day, you should always be able to get to sleep at the same time. Harry's suspension of disbelief blew completely out the window. You're giving me a time machine to treat my sleep disorder? You're giving me a time machine to treat my sleep disorder? You're giving me a time machine in order to treat my sleep disorder? Harry's mouth said. Now he was holding the necklace away from him as though it were a live bomb. Well, no, not as if it were a live bomb. That didn't begin to describe the severity of the situation. Harry held the necklace away from him as though it were a time machine. Say, Professor McGonagall, did you know that time reversed ordinary matter looks just like antimatter? Why, yes it does. Did you know that 1 kilogram of antimatter encountering 1 kilogram of matter will annihilate in an explosion equivalent to 43 million tons of TNT? Do you realise that I myself weigh 41 kilograms and that the resulting blast would leave a giant smoking crater where there used to be Scotland? Excuse me, Harry managed to say, but this sounds really, really, really dangerous. Harry's voice didn't quite rise to the shriek. He couldn't possibly scream loud enough to do this situation justice, so there was no point in trying. Professor McGonagall looked upon him with tolerant affection. I'm glad you're taking this seriously, Mr. Potter, but time turners aren't that dangerous. We wouldn't give them to children if they were. Really? Harry said. Of course you wouldn't give time machines to children if they were dangerous. What was I thinking? So, just to be clear, sneezing on this device will not send me into the Middle Ages where I will run over the Gutenberg with a horse cart and prevent the Enlightenment? Because, I hate it when that happens to me. McGonagall's lips were twitching in that way she had when she was trying not to smile. She offered Harry the pamphlet she was holding, but Harry was carefully holding out the necklace with both hands and staring at the hourglass to make sure it wasn't about to turn. Don't worry, McGonagall said after a momentary pause when it became clear that Harry wasn't going to move. That can't possibly happen, Mr. Potter. The time turner can be used to move. The time turner cannot be used to move more than 6 hours backwards. It can't be used more than 6 times in any day. Oh, good, very good to hear that. And if someone bumps into me, the time turner will not break and will not trap the whole castle of Hogwarts in an endlessly repeating loop of Thursdays. Well, they can be fragile, said McGonagall, and I do think I've heard about strange things happening if they're broken, but nothing like that. Perhaps, Harry said when he could speak again, you ought to provide your time machines with some sort of protective shell rather than leaving the glass exposed, so as to prevent that from happening. McGonagall looked quite struck. That's an excellent idea, Mr. Potter. I shall inform the Ministry of it. That's it. It's official. They've ratified it in Parliament. Everyone in the wizarding world is completely stupid. And while I hate getting all philosophical, Harry desperately tried to lower his voice to something under a shriek. Has anyone thought about the implications of going back 6 hours and doing something that changes time, which would pretty much delete all the people affected and replace them with different versions? Oh, you can't change time, Professor McGonagall interrupted. Good heavens, Mr. Potter, do you think these would be allowed to students if that was possible? What if someone tried to change their test scores? Harry took a moment to process this. His hands relaxed just a little from their white grip on the hourglass chain. Like he wasn't holding a time machine, just a live nuclear warhead. So, Harry said slowly, people just find that the universe happens to be self-consistent somehow, even though it has time travel in it? If I and my future self interact, then I'll see the same thing as both of me, even though on my first run through, my future self is already acting in full knowledge of things that, from my own perspective, haven't happened yet. Harry's voice trailed off into the inadequacy of English. Correct, I think, said Professor McGonagall, although wizards are advised to avoid being seen by their past selves. If you're attending 2 classes at the same time and you need to cross paths with yourself, for example, the first version of you should step aside and close his eyes at at a noon time. You have a watch already. Good, so that the future you can pass. It's all there in the pamphlet. Ah, and what happens when someone ignores that advice? Professor McGonagall pursed her lips. I understand that it can be quite disconcerting. And it doesn't say create a paradox that destroys the universe. She smiled tolerantly. Mr. Potter, I think I'd remember hearing if that had ever happened. That is not reassuring. Haven't you people ever heard of the anthropic principle? And what idiot ever built one of these things for the first time? Professor McGonagall actually laughed. It was a pleasant, glad sound that would seem surprisingly out of place on that stern face. You're having another you turned into a cat moment, aren't you, Mr. Potter? You probably don't want to hear this, but it's quite endearingly cute. Turning into a cat doesn't even begin to compare to this. You know, right up until this moment, I had this awful suppressed thought somewhere in the back of my mind that the only remaining answer was that my whole universe was a computer simulation, just like in the book Simulacrum 3. But now, even that is ruled out because this little toy isn't Turing computable. A Turing machine could simulate going back into a defined moment of the past and computing a different future from there. An oracle machine could rely on the halting behavior of low-order machines. But what you're saying is that reality somehow self-consistently computes in one sweep using information that hasn't happened yet. Realization struck Harry a pile-driver blow. It all made sense now. It all finally made sense. So that's how Comet T works. Of course. The spell doesn't force funny events to happen. It just makes you feel an impulse to drink right before funny things are going to happen anyway. I'm such a fool. I should have realised when I felt the impulse to drink the Comet Tea before Dumbledore's second speech. Didn't drink it and then choked on my own saliva instead. Drinking the Comet Tea doesn't cause the comedy. The comedy causes you to drink the Comet Tea. I saw the two events were correlated and assumed the Comet Tea had to be the cause. And the comedy had to be the effect. Because I thought the temporal order restrained causation, and causal graphs had to be acyclic. But it all makes sense once you draw the causal arrows going backwards in time. Realization struck Harry the second pile driver. This one he managed to keep quiet, making only a small strangling sound like a dying kitten as he realized who'd put the note on his bed this morning. Professor McGonagall's eyes were alight. After you graduate, or possibly even before, you really must teach some of these Muggle theories at Hogwarts, Mr. Potter. They sound quite fascinating, even if they're all wrong. Professor McGonagall offered him a few more pleasantries, demanded a few more promises, to which Harry nodded, said something about not talking to snakes where anyone could hear him, reminded him to read the pamphlet, and then somehow Harry found himself standing outside her office with the door closed firmly behind him. Harry said. Why, yes, his mind was blown. Not least by the fact that, if not for the prank, he might well have never obtained a time turner in the first place. Or would Professor McGonagall have given it to him anyway, only later in the day when he got around to asking about his sleep disorder or telling her about the Sorting Hat's message? And would he, at that time, have wanted to pull a prank on himself, which would have led to him getting the time turner earlier? So that the only self-consistent possibility was the one in which the prank started before he even woke up in the morning. Harry found himself considering for the first time in his life that the answer to his question might be literally inconceivable. That since his own brain contained neurons that only ran forwards in time, there was nothing his brain could do, no operation it could perform, which could conjugate to the operation of a time turner. Up until this point, Harry had lived with the admonition of E.T. James that if you were ignorant about a phenomenon, that was a fact about your own state of mind, not a fact about the phenomenon itself. That your uncertainty was a fact about you, not a fact about whatever you were uncertain about. The ignorance existed in the mind, not in reality. That a blank map did not correspond to blank territory. There were mysterious questions, but a mysterious answer was a contradiction in terms. A phenomenon could be mysterious to some particular person, but there could be no phenomena mysterious of themselves. To worship a sacred mystery was just to worship your own ignorance. So Harry had looked upon magic and refused to be intimidated. People had no sense of history. They learned about chemistry and biology and astronomy and thought that these matters had always been the proper meat of science. They had never been mysterious. The stars had once been mysteries. Lord Kelvin had once called the nature of life and biology the response of muscles to human will and the generation of trees from seeds. A mystery infinitely beyond the reach of science. Not just a little beyond, mind you, but infinitely beyond. Lord Kelvin certainly had felt a huge emotional charge from not knowing something. Every mystery ever solved had been a puzzle from the dawn of the human species right up until someone solved it. Now, for the first time, he was up against the prospect of a mystery that was threatening to be permanent. If time didn't work by acyclic causal networks, then Harry didn't understand what was meant by cause and effect. And if Harry didn't understand causes and effects, then he didn't understand what sort of stuff reality might be made of instead. And it was entirely possible that his human mind never could understand, because his brain was made of old-fashioned linear time neurons, and this time had turned out to be an impoverished subset of reality. On the plus side, the commentee, which had once seemed all-powerful and all-unbelievable, had turned out to have a much simpler explanation, which he'd missed merely because the truth was completely outside his hypothesis space or anything that his brain had evolved to comprehend. But now he had actually figured it out, probably, which was sort of encouraging. Well, sort of. Harry glanced at his watch. It was nearly time, nearly 11 a.m. He'd gotten to sleep last night at 1 a.m. So in the natural state of affairs, he'd go to sleep tonight at 3 a.m. So to go to sleep at 10 p.m. and wake up at 7 a.m., he should go back 5 hours total, which meant that if he wanted to get back to his dorm around 6 a.m. before anyone was awake, he'd better hurry up. And even in retrospect, Harry didn't understand how he pulled off half the stuff involved in the prank. Where had the pie come from? Harry was starting to seriously fear time travel. On the other hand, he had to admit that it had been an irreplaceable opportunity. A prank you could only pull on yourself once in a lifetime, within 6 hours of when you first found out about time turners. In fact, that was even more puzzling when Harry thought about it. Time had presented him with the finished prank as a fait accompli, and yet it was, quite clearly, his own handiwork. Concept and execution and writing style, every last part, even the ones he still didn't understand. Well, time was a-wasting, and there were at most 30 hours in a day. Harry did know some of what he had to do, and he might figure out the rest, like the pie, while he was working. There was no point putting it off. He couldn't exactly accomplish anything stuck here in the future. 5 hours earlier, Harry was sneaking into his dorm with his robes pulled up over his head as a thin sort of disguise, just in case someone was already up and about and saw him at the same time as Harry lying in his bed. He didn't want to have to explain to anyone about his little medical problem with spontaneous duplication. Fortunately, it seemed that everyone was still asleep. And there also seemed to be a box wrapped in red and green paper with a bright golden ribbon lying next to his bed. The perfect stereotypical image of a Christmas present, although it wasn't Christmas. Harry crept in as softly as he could manage, just in case someone had their quieter turned down low. There was an envelope attached to the box, closed by plain clear wax without a seal impressed. Harry carefully pried the envelope open and took out the letter inside. The letter said, "This is the cloak of invisibility of Ignotus Peveril, passed down through his descendants, the Potters. Unlike lesser cloaks and spells, it has the power to keep you hidden, not merely invisible. Your father lent it to me to study shortly before he died, and I confess that I have received much good use of it over the years. In the future, I shall have to get along with disillusionment, I fear. It is the time the cloak was returned to you, its heir. I had thought to make this a Christmas present, but it wished to come back to your hand before then. It seems to expect you to have need of it. Use it well. No doubt you are already thinking of all manner of wonderful pranks, as your father committed in his day. If his full misdeeds were known, every woman in Gryffindor would gather to desecrate his grave. I shall not try to stop history from repeating, but be most careful not to reveal yourself. If Dumbledore saw a chance to possess one of the Deathly Hallows, he would never let it escape his grasp until the day he died. A very Merry Christmas to you." The note was unsigned. "Hold on," Harry said, pulling up short as the other boys were about to leave the Ravenclaw dorm. "Sorry, there's something else I've got to do with my trunk. I'll be along to breakfast in a couple of minutes." Terry Boot scowled at Harry. You better not be planning to go through any of our things." Harry held up one hand. "I swear that I intend to do nothing of the sort to any of your things, that I only intend to access objects that I myself own, that I have no pranking or otherwise questionable intentions towards any of you, and that I do not anticipate those intentions changing before I get to the breakfast in the Great Hall." Terry frowned. "Wait, is that—" "Don't worry," said Penelope Clearwater, who was there to guide them. "There were no loopholes. Well worded, Mr. Potter. You should be a lawyer." Harry blinked at that. "Ah, yes, Ravenclaw prefect." "Thank you," he said. "I think. When you try to find the Great Hall, you will get lost," Penelope stated this in the tones of a flat, unarguable fact. "As soon as you do, ask a portrait how to get to the first floor. Ask another portrait the instant you suspect you might be lost again, especially if it seems like you're going up higher and higher. If you are higher than the whole castle ought to be, stop and wait for search parties. Otherwise, we shall see you again 4 months later, and you will be 5 months older and dressed in a loincloth and covered in snow. And that's if you stay inside the castle." "Understood," Harry said, swallowing hard. Shouldn't you tell students all that sort of stuff right away?" Penelope sighed. "What, all of it? That would take weeks. You'll pick it up as you go along." She turned to go, followed by the other students. "If I don't see you at breakfast in 30 minutes, Potter, I'll start the search." Once everyone was gone, Harry attached the note to his bed He'd already written it and all the other notes, working in his cabin level before everyone else woke up. Then he carefully reached inside the quietest field and pulled the cloak of invisibility off Harry One's still sleeping form. And just for the sake of mischief, Harry put the cloak on into Harry One's pouch, knowing it would thereby already be in his own. I can see that the message is passed on to Cornelian Flubberwort, said the painting of a man with aristocratic airs and, in fact, a perfectly normal nose. But might I ask where it came from originally? Harry shrugged with artful helplessness. I was told that it was spoken by a hollow voice that bellied forth from a gap within the air itself, a gap that opened upon a fiery abyss. Hey, Hermione said in tones of indignation from her place on the other side of the breakfast table. That's everyone's dessert. You can't just take your one whole pie and put it in your pouch. I'm not taking one pie, I'm taking two. Sorry, everyone, got to run now. Harry ignored the cries of outrage and left the Great Hall. He needed to arrive at herbology class a little early. Professor Sprout eyed him sharply. And how do you know what the Slytherins are planning? I can't name my source, Harry said. In fact, I have to ask you to pretend that this conversation never happened. Just act like you happened across them naturally while you were on an errand or something. I'll run on ahead as soon as herbology gets out. I think I can distract the Slytherins until I get there. I'm not easy to scare or bully, and I don't think they'll dare to seriously hurt the boy who lived, though I'm not asking you to run in the hallways, but I would appreciate it if you didn't dawdle along the way. Professor Sprout looked at him for a long moment. Then her expression softened. Please be careful with yourself, Harry Potter, and thank you. Just be sure you're not late, Harry said, and remember, when you get there, you weren't expecting to see me, and this conversation never happened. It was horrible watching himself yank Neville out of the circle of Slytherins. Neville had been right. He'd used too much force, way too much force. Hello, Harry said coldly. I'm the boy who lived. 8 first-year boys, mostly the same height. One of them had a scar on his forehead, and he wasn't acting like the others. Oh, what some power the gifty give us to see ourselves as others see us. It would frame money a blunder free us, and foolish notion. Professor McGonagall was right. The Sorting Hat was right. It was clear once you saw it from the outside. There was something wrong with Harry Potter. That's the end of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Conscientiousness. Frigidero! Harry dipped a finger in the glass of water on his desk. It should have been cool, but lukewarm it was, and lukewarm it had stayed. Again. Harry was feeling very, very cheated. There were hundreds of fantasy novels scattered around the Varys household. Harry had read quite a few, and it was starting to look like he had a mysterious dark side. So, after the glass of water had refused to cooperate the first few times, Harry had glanced around the charms classroom to make sure no one else was watching, and then taken a deep breath, concentrated, and made himself angry. Thought about the Slytherins bullying Neville and the game where someone knocked down your books every time you tried to pick them up again. Thought about what Draco Malfoy had said about that 10-year-old Lovegood girl and how the Wizengamot had really operated, and the fury had entered his blood. He held out his wand in a hand that trembled with hate and said in cold tones, Frigidero! And absolutely nothing had happened. Harry had been gypped. He wanted to write to someone and demand a refund on his dark side, which clearly ought to have irresistible magical power, but had turned out to be defective. "Frigidaire," said Hermione again from the desk next to him. Her water was solid ice, and there were white crystals forming on the rim of her glass. She seemed to be totally intent on her work and not at all conscious of the other students staring at her with hateful eyes, which was either A, dangerously oblivious of her, or B, a perfectly honed performance rising to the level of fine art. "Oh, very good, Miss Granger," squeaked Phileas Flitwick, their charms professor and head of Ravenclaw, a tiny little man with no visible signs of being a past dueling champion. "Excellent, stupendous." Harry had expected to be, in the worst case, second behind Hermione. Harry would have preferred for her to be rivaling him, of course, but he could have accepted it the other way around. As of Monday, Harry was headed for the bottom of the class, a position for which he was companionably rivaling all the other Muggle-race students except Hermione, who was all alone and rivalless at the top. Poor thing. Professor Flitwick was standing over the desk of one of the other Muggleborns and quietly adjusting the way she was holding her wand. Harry looked over at Hermione. He was swallowing hard. It was the obvious role for her in the scheme of things. "Hermione," Harry said tentatively, "do you have any idea what I might be doing wrong?" Hermione's eyes lit up with a terrible light of helpfulness, and something in the back of Harry's brain screamed in desperate humiliation. 5 minutes later, Harry's water did seem noticeably cooler than room temperature, and Hermione had given him a few verbal pats on the head and told him to pronounce it more carefully next time, and gone off to help someone else. Professor Flitwick had given her a house point for helping him. Harry was gritting his teeth so hard his jaw ached, and that wasn't helping his pronunciation. "I don't care if it's unfair competition. I know exactly what I'm going to do with the extra hours of every day. I'm going to sit in my trunk and study until I am keeping up with Hermione Granger." "Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts," said Professor McGonagall. There was no trace of any levity on the face of the stern old witch. "Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned." Her wand came down and tapped her desk, which smoothly reshaped itself into a pig. A couple of Muggleborn students gave out small yelps. The pig looked around and snorted, seeming confused, and then became a desk again. The Transfiguration professor looked around the classroom, and then her eyes settled on one student. "Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall, "you only received your school books a few days ago. Have you started reading your Transfiguration textbook?" "No, sorry, Professor," Harry said. "You needn't apologize, Mr. Potter. If you were inclined to read ahead, you would have been told to do so." Professor McGonagall's fingers rapped the desk in front of her. "Mr. Potter, would you care to guess whether thus is a desk which I transfigured into a pig, or if it began as a pig and I briefly removed the transfiguration? If you had read the first chapter of your textbook, you would know." Harry's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "I guess it'd be easier to start with a pig, since if it started as a desk, it might not know how to stand up." Professor McGonagall shook her head. "No fault to you, Mr. Potter, but the correct answer is that in Transfiguration you do not care to guess. Wrong answers will be marked with extreme severity. Questions left blank will be marked with great leniency. You must learn to know what you do not know. If I ask ask you any question, no matter how obvious or elementary, and you answer, "I'm not sure," I will not hold it against you, and anyone who laughs will lose house points. Can you tell me why this rule exists, Mr. Potter? Because a single error in transfiguration is incredibly dangerous? No. Correct! Transfiguration is more dangerous than apparition, which is not taught until your 6th year. Unfortunately, transfiguration must be learned and practiced at a young age to maximize your adult ability. So this is a dangerous subject, and you should be quite scared of making any mistakes, because none of my students have ever been permanently injured, and I will be extremely put out if you are the first class to spoil my record. Several students gulped. Professor McGonagall stood up and moved over to the wall behind her desk, which held a polished wooden board. There are many reasons why transfiguration is dangerous, but one reason stands above all the rest. She produced a short quill with a thick end and used it to sketch letters in red, which she then underlined using the same marker in blue. Transfiguration is not permanent. Transfiguration is not permanent, said Professor McGonagall. Transfiguration is not permanent. Mr. Potter, suppose a student transfigured a block of wood into a cup of water and you drank it. What do you imagine might happen to you when the transfiguration wore off? There was a pause. Excuse me, I should not have asked that of you, Mr. Potter. I forgot that you are blessed with an unusually pessimistic imagination. I'm fine, Harry said, swallowing hard. So the first answer is that I don't know. The professor nodded approvingly. But I imagine that there might be wood in my stomach and in my bloodstream, and if any of that water had gotten absorbed into my body tissues, would it be wood pulp or solid wood? Or Harry's grasp of magic failed him. He couldn't understand how wood mapped into water in the first place, so he couldn't understand what would happen after the water molecules were scrambled by ordinary thermal motions and the magic wore off and the mapping reversed. McGonagall's face was stiff. As Mr. Potter has correctly reasoned, he would become extremely sick and require immediate fluing to St. Mungo's Hospital if he was to have any chance of survival. Please turn to your textbooks to page 5. Even without any sound in the moving picture, you could tell that the woman was horribly discolored skin was screaming. The criminal who originally transferred gold into wine and gave it to this woman to drink in payment of the debt, as he put it, received a sentence of 10 years in Azkaban. Please turn to page 6. That is a Dementor. They are the guardians of Azkaban. They suck away at your magic, your life, and any happy thoughts that you try to have. The picture on page 7 is of the criminal 10 years later on his release. You will note that he is dead. Yes, Mr. Potter? Professor, Harry said, if the worst happens in a case like that, is there any way of maintaining the transfiguration? No, Professor McGonagall said flatly. Sustaining a transfiguration is a constant drain on your magic, which scales with the size of the target form, and you would need to recontact the target every few hours, which is, in a case like this, impossible. Disasters like this are unrecoverable. Professor McGonagall leaned forward, her face very hard. You will absolutely never, under any circumstances, transfigure anything into a liquid or a gas. No water No air. Nothing like water, nothing like air. Even if it is not meant to drink, liquid evaporates. Little bits and pieces of it get into the air. You will not transfigure anything that is to be burned. It will make smoke, and someone could breathe that smoke. You will never transfigure anything that could conceivably go inside anyone's body by any means. No food, nothing that looks like food, not even as a funny little prank where you mean to tell them about your mud pie before they actually eat it. You will never do it, period. Inside this classroom or out of it or anywhere. Is that well understood by every single student? Yes, said Harry, Hermione, and a few others. The rest seemed speechless. Is that understood by every single student? Yes, they all said, or muttered or whispered. If you break any of these rules, you will not further study transfiguration during your stay at Hogwarts. Repeat along with me. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or a gas. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or a gas, said the students in a ragged chorus. Again, louder. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or a gas. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or a gas. I will never transfigure anything that looks like food or anything else that goes inside a human body. I will never transfigure anything that is to be burned because it could make smoke. You will never transfigure anything that looks like money, including Muggle money, said Professor McGonagall. The goblins have ways of finding out who did it. As a matter of recognized law, the Goblin Nation is in a permanent state of war with all magical counterfeiters. They will not send orders. They will send an army. I will never transfigure anything that looks like money, repeated the students. And above all, said Professor McGonagall, you will not transfigure any living subject, especially yourselves. It will make you very sick and possibly dead, depending on how you transfigure yourself and how long you maintain the change. Professor McGonagall paused. Mr. Potter is currently holding up his hand because he has seen an animagus transformation, specifically a human transforming into a cat and back again. But an animagus transformation is not free transfiguration. Professor McGonagall took a small chunk of wood out of her pocket. With a tap of her wand, it became a glass ball. Then she said, Christopherian, and the glass ball became a steel ball. She tapped it with her wand one last time, and the steel ball became a piece of wood once more. Christopherian transforms a subject of solid glass into a similarly shaped target of solid steel. It cannot do the reverse, nor can it transform a desk into a pig. The most general form of transfiguration, free transfiguration, which you will be learning here, is capable of transforming any subject into any target, at least so far as physical form is concerned. For this reason, free transfiguration must be done wordlessly. Using charms would require different words for every different transformation between subject and target. Professor McGonagall gave her students a sharp look. Some teachers begin with transfiguration charms and move on to free transfiguration afterwards. Yes, that would be much easier in the beginning, but it can set you in a poor mold which impairs your abilities later. Here, you will learn free transfiguration from the very start, which requires that you cast the spell wordlessly by holding the subject form, the target form, and the transformation within your own mind. And to answer your next question, Mr. Potter, Professor McGonagall went on, it is free transfiguration which you must never do to any living subject. There are charms and potions which can safely, reversibly transform living subjects in limited ways. An animagus with a missing limb will still be missing that limb after transforming, for example. Free transfiguration is not safe. Your body will change while it is transfigured. Breathing, for example, results in a constant loss of the body's stuff to the surrounding air. When the transfiguration wears off and your body tries to revert to its original form, it will not be able to do so. If you press your wand to your body and imagine yourself with golden hair, afterwards your skin will fall out. If you visualize yourself as someone with clearer skin, you will be taking a long stay at some Mongols. And if you transfigure yourself into an adult bodily form, then when the transfiguration wears off, you will die. That explained why he'd seen such things as fat boys or girls less than perfectly pretty, or old people for that matter. That wouldn't happen if you could just transfigure yourself every morning. Harry raised his hand and tried to signal Professor McGonagall with his eyes. Yes, Mr. Potter. Is it possible to transfigure a living subject into a target that is static, such as a coin? No, excuse me, I'm terribly sorry. Let's just say a steel ball. Professor McGonagall shook her head. Mr. Potter, even inanimate objects undergo small changes over time. There would be no visible changes to your body afterwards, and for the first minute you would notice nothing wrong. But in an hour you would be sick, and in a day you would be dead. Excuse me, so if I'd read the first chapter, I could have guessed that the desk was originally a desk and not a pig, Harry said, but only if I made the further assumption that you didn't want to kill the pig. That might seem highly probable, but I can foresee that marking your tests would be an endless source of delight to me, Mr. Potter. But if you have other questions, can I ask you to wait until after the class? No further questions, Professor. Now repeat after me, said Professor McGonagall. I will never try to transfigure any living subject, especially myself, unless specifically instructed to do so using a specialized charm or potion. If I am not sure whether a transfiguration is safe, I will not try it until I have asked Professor McGonagall, or Professor Flitwick, or Professor Snape, or the headmaster, who are the only recognized authorities on transfiguration at Hogwarts. Asking another student is not acceptable, even if they say that they remember asking the same question. Even if the defense professor at Hogwarts tells me that a transfiguration is safe, and even if I see the defense professor do it and nothing bad seems to happen, I will not try it myself. I have the absolute right to refuse to perform any transfiguration about which I feel the slightest bit nervous, since not even the headmaster of Hogwarts can order me to do otherwise. I certainly will not accept any such order from the defense professor, even if the defense professor threatens to deduct 100 house points and have me expelled. If I break any of these rules, I will not further study transfiguration during my time at Hogwarts. We will repeat these rules at the start of every class for the first month, said Professor McGonagall. And now we will begin with matches as subjects and needles as targets. Put away your wands, thank you, and by begin, I meant that you will be taking notes. Half an hour before the end of class, Professor McGonagall handed out the matches. At the end of the class, Hermione had a silvery-looking match, and the entire rest of the class, Muggleborn or otherwise, had exactly what they'd started with. Professor McGonagall awarded her another point for Ravenclaw. After the transfiguration class was dismissed, Hermione came over to Harry's desk as Harry... I might just check.
Okay.
We've only got about 3 pages left, so I'm just going to finish off. After the Transfiguration class was dismissed, Hermione came over to Harry's desk as Harry was putting away his books into his pouch. "You know," Hermione said with an innocent expression on her face, "I earned 2 points for Ravenclaw today." "So you did," Harry said shortly. "But that wasn't as good as your 7 points," she said. "I guess I'm just not as intelligent as you." Harry finished feeding his homework into the pouch and turned to Hermione with his eyes narrowed. He'd actually forgotten about that. She batted her eyelashes at him. "We have lessons every day, though. I wonder how long it will take you to find some more... We have lessons every day, though. I wonder how long it will take you to find some more Hufflepuffs to rescue. Today is Monday, so that gives you until Thursday." The two of them stared into each other's eyes, unblinking. Harry spoke first. "Of course, you realize this means war. I didn't know that we'd been at peace." All of the other students were now watching with fascinated eyes. All of the other students, plus, unfortunately, Professor McGonagall. "Oh, Mr. Potter," sang Professor McGonagall from the other side of the room. "I have some good news for you. Madame Pomfrey has approved your suggestion for preventing breakage in her spinster wickets, and the plan is to finish the job by the end of the week. I'd say that deserves, let's call it, 10 points for Ravenclaw." Hermione's face was gaping in betrayal and shock. Harry imagined his own face didn't look much different. "Professor," Harry whispered, "those 10 points are unquestionably deserved, Mr. Potter. I would not hand out house points on a whim. To you, it might have been a simple matter of seeing something fragile and suggesting a way to protect it. But spinster wickets are expensive, and the headmaster was not pleased by the last time one broke." Professor McGonagall looked thoughtful. "I wonder if any other student has ever earned 17 house points on his first day of lessons. I'll have to look it up, but I suspect that's a new record. Perhaps we should have an announcement at dinner time." "Professor!" Harry shrieked. "This is our war. Stop meddling." "Now you have until Thursday of next week, Mr. Potter, unless, of course, you engage in some sort of mischief and lose house points before then. Addressing a professor disrespectfully, for example." Professor McGonagall put a finger on her cheek and looked reflective. "I expect you'll hit negative numbers before the end of Friday." Harry's mouth snapped shut. He sent his best death glare at Professor McGonagall, but she only seemed to find it amusing. "Yes, definitely an announcement at dinner," Professor McGonagall mused. "But it wouldn't do to offend the Slytherins, so the announcement should be brief. Just the number of points and the fact of the record. And if anyone comes to you for help with their schoolwork and is disappointed that you haven't even started reading your textbooks, you can always refer them to Miss Granger." "Professor," said Hermione in a rather high-pitched voice. Professor McGonagall ignored her. I wonder how long it will take before Miss Granger does something deserving of a dinner-time announcement. I look forward to seeing it, whatever it may be." Harry and Hermione, by unspoken mutual consent, turned and stormed out of the classroom. They were followed by a trail of hypnotized Ravenclaws. Harry said, "Are we still on after dinner?" "Of course," said Hermione. "I wouldn't want you to fall further behind on your studying." "Why, thank you, and let me say that as brilliant as you are already, I can't help but wonder what you'll be like once you have some elementary training in rationality. Is it really that useful? It didn't seem to help you with charms or transfiguration." There was a slight pause. "Well, I only got my school books 4 days ago. That's why I had to earn those 17 house points without using my wand." 4 days? Maybe you can't read 8 books in 4 days, but you might have at least read one. How many days will it take to finish at that rate? You know all the mathematics, so can you tell me what's 8 times 4 divided by 0? I've got classes now, which you didn't, but weekends are free, so limit of 8 times 4 divided by epsilon as epsilon approaches 0 plus 1047 on Sunday, I'd say. I did it in 3 days, actually. 247 on Saturday it is then. I'm sure I'll find the time somewhere. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And that brings us to the end for this evening. Next chapter, lateral thinking. We'll have to wait for next week. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Bye.